Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming tonight. I appreciate you coming out despite the current challenges we all face. It's nice to see people face to face. So this is the book that came out last year during COVID. And I just wanted to point out my co-author here is Change Tan. She is a biology professor at the University of Missouri. And I'm kind of, as he said, more medicine and engineering, but it was a good combination because she could make sure the biology was correct, and I applied some engineering to how could you get life started if you wanted to start life, and we'll get into that. But I want to start off with something completely not controversial. How many people have seen something die? A dead thing. How many people have seen a dead thing? Everybody? So we all know what happens when a living thing dies, right? There is a one-way path of decay and disorder wherein the complicated molecules, highly organized, that made up that living thing, they start to fall apart, start to decay, and it becomes dust, right? And this is something that we've all very familiar with. It's a purely natural process. It's directly observable. Every person in this room has observed this, right? So you know what happens. It's universal, meaning we can't avoid it. It's going to happen to us. It's irreversible. There's no way of coming down to here and then turning around and going back that way, right? And so it's all kind of common sense. But despite all of this that we're all so familiar with, there's a growing number of people, and in fact some pretty smart people, who believe the opposite happened. That you start with some primordial soup, and from there, molecules become more and more complicated, and they get very organized, and it's something called abiogenesis, is the process of how life first got started. Oh, thank you. So it is surprising to me that an increasing number of people believe that this is true, despite the fact that this is very unnatural. And what I mean by that is that through science we learn natural laws. We know what chemistry does, what physics does, and thermodynamics. This goes against what we understand about natural laws, what we've learned from science. It's unobservable, meaning that everyone here has seen the other thing happen, but not a single person ever in history has seen this happen. So it's unscientific, and it's irrational, and it's a faith-based position. But like I said, more and more people are believing it. So I wanted to write a book to try to stop that. Here's some people who believe it. We have Carl Sagan. You're probably familiar with Carl Sagan. He said, "The origin of life must be a highly probable affair. As soon as conditions permit, up it pops." And you can say a statement like that without anyone ever having observed that happen, ever. And what's most surprising, I think, is that he made that statement, and he also made this statement, that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And those two seem very conflicting to me. So we also have Jeremy England, who was a professor of physics at MIT. Very smart guy. He now moved to Georgia Tech, professor of physics. And he said, you start with a random clump of atoms, and if you shine light on it for long enough, it shouldn't be so surprising that you get a plant. We have Bill Nye the Science Guy. Everybody knows Bill Nye the Science Guy, right? He said the origin of life just requires some raw material that could allow the spark of life to emerge. To me, that's a very non-scientific statement. Again, nobody has observed this. I think perhaps Bill Nye was inspired by Pinocchio, because you have a wooden puppet that just needed the spark of life. And strangely, this is a quote from a book called Undeniable. It is undeniable. Now, what is perhaps most disturbing is not that these individuals believe this and profess it, but this is being taught in our public schools, and it's being taught to all of our children in public schools. So here's a public school biology textbook. It says, life began when organic molecules assembled in a coordinated manner within a cell membrane and began reproducing. And it's not stated like we suspect or we think or maybe or It's as if you're slamming your fist on the table and saying, this is fact. 2 + 2 is 4, and this is also a fact. Here's another biology textbook. Life arose from non-life via chemical evolution. Chemical evolution is another term for abiogenesis. It means instead of life evolving, it's actually molecules evolving, chemicals evolving. So all of this is having a very unfortunate effect on our society, and I think it's well summed up by this survey. This survey was mentioned by Jim Torr. I don't know if you've seen videos by him, but he mentioned this. John Narcombe, who's a professor of marketing from Arkansas Tech, he surveyed 715 people with this question: true or false? Scientists researching the origin of life have created simple life forms from scratch. That is, in laboratory experiments trying to approximate the Earth's early atmosphere, scientists have mixed chemicals believed to exist before the first life forms to successfully create simple life forms such as bacteria. So basically saying, can you create bacteria in a laboratory by mixing up some stuff? And what blew me away is that 72.7% of the respondents agreed with the statement. They thought it was true. Now, 3 out of 4 people said true. Now, I know that public understanding of science isn't always great, but to get 3 out of 4 to be that confused about something that's so dramatically false, it's very disturbing, and I think it's only an indoctrination and a continual barrage of media that can get people to believe that kind of thing. This is about as true as a statement of, like, humans have been to other galaxies. Basically, like, Star Trek is real, right? That's how false this statement is, and yet 3 out of 4 people believe it. So we got to do something about that, and I'm trying to, and I wrote a book and so forth. So in the book, we go through, what would it actually take to start life through natural processes? Not just a scientist in a lab who's got some intelligence and is, even though that's impossible, we're talking about something even harder here of just nature all by itself on its own, no intelligence, trying to start life. What would it take? So we came up with a series of requirements. In order to start life, you have to start with nothing but a few molecules. You start with basic chemistry, and then you have to meet all of these requirements in order to get to biology, which is a living thing. And we're talking about the simplest living thing, a single cell. You have to go through all of these things. And I'm going to walk through them. I'm not going to go through all of them. All the details are in the book. We'll go through some of the fun ones. But keep in mind that this staircase has a strong force of gravity. And that's what we just talked about, is death and decay. Someday, I personally am going to fall down this staircase from a living thing back down to dust, right? It's just gravity is going to pull you down. And so these folks are trying to convince you that it's possible to climb the staircase through natural processes. So let's take a look at the first step on the staircase. Here we're talking about just getting to the basic building blocks of life, like amino acids or nucleotides or lipids. The basic building blocks that assemble the important molecules that make up life. How do you get those to form from natural processes? And every biology textbook today will talk about the Miller-Urey experiment. Maybe you've heard that. They had an apparatus, and they put in some gases, and they boiled water, and then they put some sparks in there, and they got some amino acids, which is one of the important building blocks. So to talk through why that's not so accurate, we made a video where I'm trying to make all this into animated video now to make it more approachable and more fun. So I'll give you a little taste of the animated video we have, which is it's on YouTube, and this is just a piece of it.
One dirty little secret of these origin of life experiments is that they don't actually start with plausible natural conditions. These experimenters, I don't want to say cheated, let's say they cheated. They sort of just cheated. These scientists begin with pure industrial strength ingredients. These are never found in nature like that in such extreme concentrations and purity, certainly not all in the same location. Billions of dollars worth of precise machinery created and operated by thousands of very intelligent people in labs all around the world over the course of many decades is what gets us to the point where these experiments can even begin. Another dirty little secret of these origin of life experiments lies in the presentation of their results. Even cheating like they did, what exactly do they end up with? The vast majority of what they make is actually toxic garbage. For example, in this paper, over 99% of what they make is not only unwanted, but effectively destroys the building block's ability to form more complex molecules. The very process that makes these building blocks also, critically, stops them dead in their tracks. A little detail your biology textbook may have left out. The third cheat is something called relay synthesis. They buy industrial strength ingredients to start with, make mostly garbage out of them, but may produce trace amounts of something they wanted. Like in this experiment, they yielded 0.011% of the nucleobase adenine. Then they declare success. These chemicals can technically be turned into adenine, even though it is unavailable to actually do anything because it's surrounded by garbage or consumed by side reactions and would quickly degrade, but whatever, details. For the next experiment, rather than starting with what the previous experiment actually produced, this mixture of garbage, instead they now feel justified in purchasing pure adenine from a laboratory supply shop to further cheat at the next step toward life. And this sort of thing happens over and over again, completely detached from reality.
All right, I'm glad the technology worked, but that gives you a feel for that first step in the process, and we're not arguing that they didn't make amino acids or make that adenine, it's that they didn't inject reality into the situation. And when you inject the reality, you find it's really not possible to complete this step. And a big part of it is, after you produce those molecules, you have to get rid of all the other stuff that we call toxic. You got to somehow filter out the stuff you want and then concentrate that stuff you want in order to move forward. And that's really difficult to do, and they kind of skip out on that. So we'll go to the next step, which is about homochirality. And I think Ken here knows a lot about homochirality. So you've probably seen this before, but a lot of the biological molecules in your body have two hands. They could come in a left-handed form and a right-handed form. And if you just go into a chemical lab and produce these things, you're going to get a 50-50 mixture every time. So if life came from natural processes, what you'd expect is a 50-50 mixture all the time, because that's natural, that's what happens. But life, of course, is very, very particular about chirality. If you look at an amino acid, it's a simple polypeptide, but 19 out of the 20 amino acids that make up our proteins have a chiral location, but they're indicated there. And if only one amino acid in a protein is replaced by the wrong chirality, these are all left-handed. If you put a right-handed one in there, the formed protein will not fulfill its tasks because it changes the shape of the protein and it can't do its job. So life is exquisitely sensitive to chirality. And even if you look at DNA, we're very familiar with this shape, the double helix of DNA. Every one of these little rungs, or half a rung, is called a nucleotide. And that's what a nucleotide looks like. And every nucleotide actually has 3 chiral locations. So there are 2 possibilities times 2 times 2. So there's 8 different possible chiralities in every one of the 3.2 billion nucleotides in the DNA in every cell in your body. And they are all the same exact chirality. So it's extremely unnatural to come up with that. It's like flipping heads like 9 billion times and getting heads. So there's nothing natural about that. It's very unnatural. So that's a step that they haven't been able to get over that one. We're going to jump ahead 2 steps here, and now we're going to talk about getting the building blocks that were formed. How do you get those to link up perfectly to make a polymer, like DNA? So when you see DNA in a textbook, you always see this picture, familiar with this, and so you think maybe this is the only way that this molecule could have formed. That's just what it does. But there's billions of different ways to bring this together. It can take a left turn. It can be, show you some examples. This is just 2 nucleotides that make up that DNA double helix. This is the way that it has to be in all of life. But you could have this molecule turn this way, you could have this turn this way, you could have the phosphate bond be a 3' 3' instead of a 2' 5', which it normally is. All these things can be wrong at any of the nucleotides and get it all wrong. So linking them up perfectly is extremely difficult and very unnatural. So the simplest forms of life, I mentioned you have 3.2 billion nucleotides. The simplest forms of life, a single cell bacteria, the simplest of bacteria, has about 500,000 of these nucleotides, and they have to be perfectly lined up and perfectly homochiral in order to have life. So we can't get a life simpler than that, and yet that's what's required to get to life. So these long, perfectly arranged biopolymers, like proteins, RNA, DNA, they're very unnatural. It's not what natural processes tend to produce. Then we'll go up to the next step, where we have what's called biopolymer reproduction. So everybody knows in order to have life, you have to have things that can reproduce. Life has to be able to reproduce. It's one of the defining things about life. But reproducing an entire cell is very, very complicated. And the origin of life people who believe life just started naturally, they recognize that. They know that cells reproducing is really, really hard. So they say, hey, let's just start with individual molecules reproducing. Just get a protein or an RNA to reproduce itself, and then that'll be good, because after that, chemical evolution could take over. And what they mean by chemical evolution is a molecule that can replicate itself, and then maybe there's some errors in the replication, and there's a process that picks out the best molecules and throws out the bad ones, and then it gets better and better and better over time. That's what evolution is supposed to do. Now, unfortunately, a lot of people will give you misinformation about self-replicating molecules. This is a professor of chemistry from Israel, and in his book he says, quote, molecular self-replication reaction is a reality. It's a reaction that actually does take place. This can only be a true statement if you accept the most generous, the most charitable definition of self-replication of a molecule. You also see papers. This is a manuscript that says self-replicating RNA. So you think, hey, it must be solved. They've done this. But if you actually read the paper, you find out that they're very, very far from what you would define self-replicating as. What they did, and I'll make this simple here, they took a molecule of RNA and they broke it in half, and they want to get it bonded back together again to say now it's a full RNA molecule. So imagine that I desired to make a self-replicating car, and I took a brand new car and I just cut it in half, and then on both halves I installed some magnets and some like mechanical clasping things. And then I bring out another car, brand new car, and I just take the new car, which is functional, and I just push them together, and then click, there's a magnetic attraction, they come together, and now I have another car that can work. Would you accept it if I said I've now created the world's first self-replicating car? We don't need factories anymore. We just let them do their thing, and we have cars everywhere. That's basically what these experimenters have done. In this paper, they basically took a molecule that they had designed, an RNA, and then they broke it in half and put the two halves in water, and then they put in a complete one in the water, and the complete one lines up the two halves, and then the two halves bonded together, and they say self-replicating molecules. So this, I think, is what is misleading the public into believing. That survey I showed you, these kinds of things mislead the public because they're overstating what they actually did. So don't let anybody tell you that there are self-replicating molecules. For many reasons, self-replicating molecules are highly unnatural. In order for life to have started, you wouldn't just need like one self-replicating molecule, but they must be pervasive. Like if you work with RNA, you go in the lab and you're like, gee, there's another self-replicating. It should be all over the place, self-replicating RNAs, because They need to evolve, 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 evolve to get to life. It should be very common to find them. But in 75 years, nobody's found one. So we'll move up a few steps. This one you've probably never heard of, but the biopolymers in your body right now, in my body, need to be repaired constantly. And that's required for life. Because water, ultraviolet radiation, oxidative damage, it's constantly breaking up your DNA, constantly causing damage to proteins and DNA. And fortunately, we are blessed with systems that constantly repair your DNA. So if you take your DNA, the double helix, and you wind it so it looks like a ladder, it looks like a ladder like this. And if you have one base that's damaged, maybe you had ultraviolet radiation, you were out in the sun today, and you damage it, your body has these processes to repair it. This is an enzyme. An enzyme is a long, complicated protein. First enzyme takes away the damaged base. Another enzyme kind of opens up the ladder. Another enzyme removes that piece of the ladder and prepares it. And then you have two enzymes here that replace and fixes it to the right way. And that's the simplest of you have about a dozen repair mechanisms built into your being. And if you didn't have them, you wouldn't be here. And this one is the simplest one, and it takes 5 enzymes. And those enzymes are very complicated. They don't just come about. So the real trick to this is that these enzymes, they are manufactured by your body via your DNA. So if you think this through, the DNA holds the information to produce these enzymes, which are absolutely required to preserve your DNA. But the information's in the DNA. You see the sort of circular logic there? You can't have the repair mechanisms without having the repair mechanisms because they come from the DNA. So how could all that get started naturally? This is called Eigen's paradox. If you want a fancy term for it, Eigen figured this out, that we've got this paradox here. We can't solve this chicken and egg situation. So any kind of chicken and egg scenario like this is a very unnatural situation. Humans, engineers, can create chicken and egg situations. Like, what good is a cell phone unless you have towers that have cell phone data, right? It doesn't make sense to have one without the other, but humans could design that and make it work. We can make a chicken and egg thing work. Okay, let's move up a notch to talk about the membranes of the cell. This is one that the origin of life people think they got figured out, because all membranes in all cells of life are made up of phospholipids. This particular molecule here is called a phospholipid. And if you take phospholipids and you put them in water under the right situations, they'll form into this kind of a bilayer like that. It's kind of pretty. And then it'll actually, in the right conditions, it'll form into a sphere, kind of like a bubble. And that kind of looks like a cell if you squint your eyes. So they have something they claim big success with, that this happens spontaneously. We can make membranes from a natural process. But there's a big but here, that this could never support life like that. This would just be something that could hold decaying elements, kind of like putting them in a coffin. It would hold stuff so that it decays. Because actual life has a lot of requirements on that cell membrane. One of the functions of your cell membrane is to maintain an electric voltage between the outside and inside of the cell. There's a voltage. Just like in the wall here, between one conductor and another conductor, there's a voltage across them. That's what's going on in your cell membranes, and that has to be there. If we took that voltage away from your cells, you'd be dead within 30 seconds. If you take cyanide, cyanide actually stops that electrical voltage across your cells, and we know what cyanide does to you. So that membrane has to be impermeable to protons. Protons are the electricity across the cell, and they can't get through. It has to stop them from getting through, or else you wouldn't have that voltage. But the membrane has to be impermeable to protons, but it also must allow larger things to get through. It has to allow food to get in, and building blocks, and it has to push waste out. So again, this is kind of chicken and egg, but how can you have a membrane so tight that it doesn't allow single protons to get through, but it's open enough that it allows amino acids to get through or waste to get out? How's that going to work? Well, the way to do that is to design the cell membrane to be full of these proteins. The cell membrane has proteins that go across it, and each of the proteins has a very specific function. Think of your house. You have a membrane. Your house, the shell of your house is that membrane. Inside, you can keep things very constant. You know, the humidity is where you want it, the temperature is where you want it, and there's food in your house. And waste, thankfully, gets out of your house. But you have special ways of removing the waste, special doors. Imagine a door to your house that only allows pizza to come in. Wouldn't that be nice? When pizza goes by, it grabs it, brings it into your house. That's what's going on in the cell membrane. The simplest known organism, this Mycoplasma genitalium, it actually produces 142 different proteins that operate in the cell membrane. And that's like the simplest, so you can't really survive with less than 142 different specialized doors in your membrane. And they don't just sort of passively let the pizza come through. They actively use energy to get the pizza and bring it in, right? So it's an active and selective process. So you can see that real life is quite a bit different than just a membrane that doesn't have a particular function to it. And this is an interesting point. No cell ever on its own can generate its own membrane from scratch. Just like every cell ever known comes from another cell, right? Life comes from life, cells come from cells. It's also true that every membrane comes from an existing membrane. Every cell inherited its membrane from its parents, and it can add to that membrane. It can add on to it, make it bigger so that it can split, but it doesn't have the ability to generate its own membrane. So how do you get the first membrane? That's pretty tricky. Another tricky thing is if the cell generates this protein here, that protein is generated inside the cell, and it's extremely difficult to get it inserted into the membrane. It needs another protein in the membrane to chaperone it, to help it get into the membrane. There's a lot of chicken and eggs going on here too. So these active and selectively permeable membranes are very unnatural and absolutely essential to have life. So then I'm going to go up one more step, and this is about harnessing energy. We all have to live on energy. You got to have pizza to survive, right? So every cell needs not only a way to acquire the energy, but to use the energy in a very specific way, like to fix your DNA, to build new building blocks, to build DNA, to replicate. All of that takes energy. And the fundamental way that living organisms harness energy is actually very similar across all of life. It goes by a fancy name of chemiosmotic coupling. But whatever the food source is, whether it's pizza, or if you're a plant, you use sunlight, or if it's or bacteria sometimes actually use sulfur as a source of energy. All of those food sources throughout life are different, but they're all converted into a voltage across the membrane. That's what the energy is often used for. And then that voltage is actually used to charge up batteries. Not literally battery, but it produces ATP, which is fully charged, from ADP, which is like a discharged battery. So your body is constantly producing this ATP, and that's like charged up batteries that then you can plug in to do all kinds of things. You can plug in a battery to fix your DNA, you plug in a battery to bring something into cells to keep the voltage going. This is what's going on in all of life. And I want to show you just a taste of what it takes in order for this process to happen. And even in the simplest life, it's an extremely complicated process. This enzyme here is made up of 16 different protein molecules. Each color is a different protein. And you can sort of admire the complexity of that thing. This is the cell membrane in blue. So this thing is sitting in the cell membrane. And this strips electrons off of your food, whatever your food happens to be, strips electrons off and uses that to pump protons from inside to outside. So you basically want to have few protons on the inside and many protons on the outside, and that's what makes this voltage that's essential for staying alive. And that's what this thing does, along with two other similar enzymes. This is the respiratory complex that's all day long pumping protons outside. And this requires, in total, there's 25 different proteins minimally in order to have this work. But you have to think, okay, having this voltage across your cell is essential for life, but it doesn't do you any good unless you have the other components which make use of it, right? This doesn't do you any good unless you have the machine that uses that voltage. And what that is ATP synthase. And this is pretty universal across all of life. ATP synthase is a nano machine, an electric motor running inside of your cells, whirring along right now. It runs at about 7,800 RPMs. It takes at least 20 interconnected proteins to build one of these things. And again, you have few protons inside. Here's the membrane, and you have many protons outside. So these protons outside really want to get back in. The membrane doesn't let them get back in. They have to get in through the electric motor. So they're driving, by going from out to in, they're driving this motor, just like if I plug a motor into the wall. It's the same kind of thing. So I'm going to show you a little video, computer graphics of how this thing works, just to give you a feel for the amazing design of it.
Of antibiotic oligomycin. And at the top we have the F1 motor from factor 1. The FO motor is a proton-powered motor. It is thought that protons flow through a channel open to just the intermembrane space, where they bind to a ring of protein subunits, rotate 360 degrees, and exit through another channel exposed only to the matrix. The net flow of protons driven by the proton motor force provides the energy for the generation of rotation. The torque generated in the FO motor is transferred to the F1 motor by a central stalk or shaft. The F1 motor is responsible for generating the ATP by addition of phosphate to ADP. The top of the central stalk acts similarly to a camshaft, so that as it rotates within the F1 motor, it causes conformational changes of the catalytic subunits. The catalytic unit is made of a dimer of subunits, and there are 3 of these arranged in a ring. Catalysis occurs at the interface between the dimers. If we concentrate on one dimer, we can observe 3 distinct states. First, ADP and phosphate bind to the catalytic site. The central shaft then rotates 120 degrees to rearrange the molecules. Next, the enzyme undergoes a further 120 degree rotation, and the ADP and phosphate are fused together to create ATP. The enzyme then rotates again to return to the starting position, where ADP is released and ADP and phosphate can be bound for the next cycle of catalysis. One key aspect of this relationship is that catalytic subunits must remain stationary with respect to a rotating central shaft. This task is performed by a scaffold on the outside of the complex, referred to as the peripheral stalk. Recent work has shown that what was once thought of as a rigid scaffold is actually dynamic and is able to accommodate the changes necessary for most efficient function. Looking at this machine in its natural environment by electron chromatography of intact mitochondria has shown that ATP synthase dimerizes to shape the mitochondrial inner membrane into their signature cristae shape.
Okay, so it goes on and on with the complexity of this. I just wanted to give you a taste of it without putting you to sleep or anything like that. But it's awesome to behold such a thing. You know that it's a machine. It's an electric motor that is driven by your food in order to charge up those batteries, and those batteries can be applied to all kinds of functions like moving a muscle, speaking, whatever it is. That's what they're used. Your body contains not so much of the ATP, maybe like 60 grams of ATP in your whole body, but throughout a day you generate your entire body weight in ATP, because it's constantly being charged and used, like plugging batteries in the wall, using them constantly all day long. It's fascinating. So how are you going to get that from a natural process? That's the question. And like I said, this is even in the simplest form of life. That very simplest bacteria is going to have these things, the same situation here. Okay, now we get to the final question. Well, we're not going to do the final step just in the interest of time, but this is the last one we're going to cover. And this talks about all of the chicken and egg things that we've talked about. I've got some more to go through. But life is just full of chicken and egg scenarios, and they're all highly unnatural. So replication of DNA is essential for life. Of course, you have to be able to replicate your DNA. That process takes 25 different proteins at minimum. The simplest form of life, it takes 25 proteins. And, you know, some people think those proteins evolved. But evolution requires reproduction. So how can you reproduce DNA unless you have those 25 proteins? But you can't have those because they come coded in the DNA. So it's a chicken and egg situation. If you can't replicate, you can't evolve. And if you can't evolve, you couldn't make the replication proteins through evolution. We also know that proteins are essential to make proteins. You know how proteins are made? They're made in a ribosome, which is largely made up of proteins. So how can you make a ribosome without a ribosome? It's a protein factory. Another one is transcription of DNA. So you transcribe the DNA to make RNA. That requires a protein. But you can't make the protein unless you already have transcription up and running. So it's another, this could go, I got dozens of these things and can go on and on. But there's chicken and egg throughout all of life, and natural processes don't make that possible. Okay, so once again, if you want to get more into details, read the book, and all the details are in there. Some of the steps we missed. But again, to remind you that we have a natural process, which is this, dragging you down the staircase, and there's really no evidence that you can climb the staircase. Now, when we wrote this book, I was a little uncomfortable with the staircase as an analogy, because it makes it sound kind of easy. You just do one step, another step, another step. It makes it seem kind of easy. But in reality, all of these things have to be fulfilled at the same time. So it's more of a cliff. You got to have all or none to make it work. I just kept the staircase because it helps to organize a book. You can have one chapter per step. So now I want to walk away from science for a moment and do a little philosophy. And the simple question is, why do people like these believe in abiogenesis? Why do they believe such a thing if everything I've shown you kind of goes against that? So here's a thought experiment. Just bear with me through this. Let's imagine that a dead body is found. And people who found the dead body didn't see what happened. Nobody knows what happened. There's just a dead body. So you call in the coroner, right? And the coroner is wondering what is the cause of death. And at the highest level, they just want to decide between two choices. Either it's a natural cause of death, like cancer, stroke, heart attack, or it's an unnatural cause of death, like a murder or suicide. That's the big decision they want to get to. So how do they figure that out? Well, of course, they look at the data, look at the evidence, gather evidence to make that decision. So let's imagine that they find in the body, they find a single wound above the ear, and when they open up the skull, the brain tissue is all kind of scrambled, and they recover inside the head a single foreign object, which is made up of lead and copper, and it looks like that. And we know that that used to look like that, right? But this coroner is pretty strange. This coroner has some really strong held beliefs. And this coroner believes very strongly that no one ever dies from an unnatural cause. They just really they can't believe anyone could ever die in this manner. So they block that out of their mind as a possibility. And now they have this data, and they want the data to point somehow to a natural cause. So they're scratching their head trying to figure this out. And then they realized that the body was found near a volcano. So it must be that the volcano erupted and spit out this thing, and it ended up in somebody's head, and that's what killed the person. So it's a natural cause of death from a volcanic eruption. That's pretty bad science, and that's a pretty bad coroner. But this is kind of what's happening here. If you look at the question of how did life first begin, how did the first life ever get started, it's really a binary question. Either it was purely natural causes or it wasn't purely natural causes. So how are we going to figure that out? Well, let's look at the evidence. So the evidence includes everything I've talked through here. We've got the homochirality, we've got these complicated cell membranes, we've got the ATP synthase, we've got all these chicken and egg stuff, the entire staircase I talked about. All of this evidence is pointing clearly here, because it definitely doesn't point that way. But the problem is we've got a really weird coroner, and our coroner blocks that out of the possible, blocks it out of possibilities. And they make this sound scientific because they basically say science has to be defined because science can only deal with natural causes. It's impossible for science to deal with anything supernatural. Science points to natural causes. So they use that as their excuse to block this out. And that is what leads them to the conclusion that life started naturally, and the case is closed. What I find perhaps even more disturbing is that when our children are kind of taught this in school, they don't even mention that this is being blocked out, right? They say, we're going to use science, and science says there's a natural cause. Why is that? It's because you define science as only being allowed to talk about natural causes. So this is being blocked out but not even mentioned, not talked about. And that's kind of pulling the wool over the eyes, I think. So there's a fancy term for this, basically saying science can only address natural causes. It has a fancy term called methodological naturalism. And the peril of applying methodological naturalism to this question of the origin of life is that because of that methodological naturalism, we have a question that cannot be answered, which is, how could natural processes cause the start of life? A question that cannot be answered has now been turned into an answer that can't be questioned. So our kids are given an answer, and you're not allowed to question it. And I'd much rather live in a world where we have questions that can't be answered than to live in a world where you have answers that can't be questioned. So why do people believe in abiogenesis? Well, they use the excuse that science can only address natural causes. But I think number two is a big part of it, that if you want to be an atheist, you really can't have a rational basis for your belief unless you can find a way to make abiogenesis work. Otherwise, it's like believing the moon is made out of cheese. You can choose to do that, but there's no science, there's no rational basis for it. So I'm going to end with this quote. This is from Harold Urey of the Miller-Urey experiment, which kind of started all this going. They were the guys that produced amino acids. And he said, all of us who study the origin of life find that the more we look into it, the more we feel it is too complex to have evolved anywhere. We all believe as an article of faith that life evolved from dead matter on this planet. So at least he was bold enough to admit that there's an element of faith to what he believed. That was 50 years ago, and nowadays no one will dare mention faith. This was pretty bold on his part. So we have the book out there. You feel free to email me there, and I also have a website that has a bunch of videos like this. You can see this video on there, and podcasts and other stuff like that. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Let's thank God for a great talk.